ever wonder what's up there?
Jack! 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 Come in, Jack! It's the Serpent Beasts! The menacing beasts! They're taking over! Jack, it's the White Willies! They're here! God help us!
Before there was Final Fantasy, and even before there was Rad Racer, Square was just one of many small Japanese companies that had splintered off from larger ones with the goal of making video games. Most of their efforts from this period in time are largely forgotten or ignored, and one such title is 1987's The 3D Battles of WorldRunner, published by Square's own label, DOG, or Disk Original Group. A small collective of like-minded studios looking to make and port games to Nintendo's still hot Famicom Disk System. The most notable thing about the 3D Battles of WorldRunner, often referred to as just 3D WorldRunner, is that it does in fact have a 3D graphical presentation, and even a 3D mode with glasses. The execution of the 3D is impressive for the time, and the graphics themselves are pleasant to look at. So is this title worth taking a look at? Is there more than meets the eye? Welcome to the 3D Battles of WorldRunner. What you see is what you get. A lot of games require a certain amount of explanation. You see things happening on screen, but it doesn't necessarily mean you understand what's going on. The 3D Battles of WorldRunner is not one of those video games. It pretty much is exactly what it appears to be. A game where the little green man walks forward and you steer him to avoid obstacles. Now, it'd be unfair to leave it at just that, and there's also nothing wrong with a game being simple. Tetris requires very little explanation. Many racing games, at least conceptually, are easy to understand the goal of. So why even bring this up? Well, I had hopes for 3D WorldRunner. Not high hopes, but I had hopes that it would kind of break out of the mold of what it appeared to be and surprise me with something. But it really is just what it is, and it doesn't really expand upon itself or grow into something with more depth. That being said, it's not exactly bad. It does a lot of cool things graphically, and each world has a sort of gimmick for you to figure out that you have to recognize and in some cases master in order to progress. 3D WorldRunner does some clever things to teach the player how to beat it. And while death is the typical messenger, sometimes when you figure something neat out on the fly, it leaves you feeling clever, which is always nice. I think it's worth knowing about and worth taking a look. So let's get into it. In 3D WorldRunner, you play as Jumpin' Jack, as clarified in the sequel, who is a space cowboy that travels from world to world to save planets from creatures known as serpent beasts. It's an action game that could also be described as a 3D runner, and in practice is kind of similar to Super Mario Bros., only with a perspective shift. Now, you can't jump on enemies and you can't stop running, so it's not that similar to Mario. And to fans of 80s arcade games, it's going to draw a comparison, an obvious comparison, to Space Harrier. The environments in 3D WorldRunner really look ripped straight out of the Fantasy Zone. But while you can shoot the enemies in this game, it's only ever really a Space Harrier clone during the boss fights. 3D WorldRunner is much more about avoiding the obstacles rather than shooting them. There are 8 total worlds that you need to complete in order to beat 3D WorldRunner. Each world has 3 to 4 stages capped off with a boss fight, and each stage tends to have its own little gimmick to it, some which build off of gimmicks taught in earlier stages. Examples of these would be forced sprinting, jumper bouncing, column hopping, or finding gaps in flame columns. The controls are also pretty simple. Forward to speed up, backward to slow down, left and right to dodge or position yourself, B to shoot if you've picked up the laser missiles power-up, and A to jump. Jumping is the most nuanced of the controls because the longer you jump, the higher you go. A lot of the challenge in 3D WorldRunner comes from trying to accurately gauge how far you need to jump over gaps, and if you'll need to slow down to not overshoot them. Enemies and barriers will make this more complicated as well as the game goes on. Start pauses the game, which freezes you in place. And if you're on the ground, which is common, you'll stop for a breather, which is one of my favorite touches about this game. Select is also assigned something, but it's less to do with the controls and more to do with the optional 3D. The game shipped with 3D glasses in Japan, and pressing select enters you into the optional 3D mode. But you don't really need the special glasses. Any red and blue 3D glasses will do. If you have some, feel free to take a peek at what it looks like, but honestly, while novel, it's a headache. Similar to games like Goemon, you can power yourself up in 3D WorldRunner, but when you lose a life, it's back to basics. The power-ups are found in the Corinthian-looking columns, which is something that I missed on my first few sessions with the game. The manual actually clarifies this for you though, where it says, quote, "Along the way, you'll run into, open parentheses, literally, close parentheses, ancient columns. You can also jump on top of them. Either way, they hold many surprises." It's just so random and also so perfect to have this be one of the game's core features. Running face first into a pillar of stone is essentially this game in a nutshell. Now, on the journey, you're gonna pick up power-ups from these columns, and they're a big part of what helps you make it through the stages. So let's go ahead and get into the different things that you can pick up from them. The power-ups you can get to help you survive are as follows. Rocket fire. This is just what enables shooting. It's kind of fun to shoot enemies, but it's honestly not worth focusing on. You should definitely spend more time gauging how far you need to jump, how high you need to jump, and just dodging enemies. Shooting them doesn't really help, at least not in my experience. The super potion is probably the most important of the power-ups that you can get from the columns because it provides body armor. It allows you to take one hit from an enemy, and it's indicated by a color palette swap with JJ. The poison mushroom is the only bad power-up that you can get, and it's not really a power-up, it's just an instant death, and you have to wonder if they're somehow calling out Mario here. Invincibility lets you run into enemies, and I've heard tell that if you hit enough in a row, it extends the length of invincibility, but I wasn't able to replicate that. Maybe I'm just bad at the game. The bonus stars are just points really, and they're kind of worthless, but I like them for a few reasons. I like that when you pick them up, it briefly stops like your progression. It kind of lets you breathe a little bit. I like being able to run into things that slow me down and let me kind of collect myself if I've been sprinting or going too fast. And then also at the end of each stage, after you defeat the boss, it counts up the stars you get, and it's satisfying to hear the little noise that they give you. And then also, you make just a bizarre pose every time you beat it. Kind of looks like you're holding up your middle finger, your pinky finger, and your thumb all at the same time. And you get to look at that and see that longer the more stars you get. So I count that as a positive, and I do like to pick up the stars. And it is also just kind of fun to try and time your jumps with the stars that go up and down and try and hit them on the way. It's one of the things in this game that feels the most satisfying. So while it doesn't really do much, I like that it's there. The warp balloons are important, and basically just always get them. They take you to a bonus zone where you can pick up stars, and they also usually have a column that you can hit in order to get a power-up. Oftentimes, it's an extra life that you find in these zones, sometimes it's shooting, and sometimes it's more time. And there are a few instances where you might be behind and you really want to pick up more time. And so I guess I'll go ahead and talk about the clock. The clock grants extra time. And it's, while I haven't gone into depth, time is important in this game. You can run out of time. It rarely happens, but it does happen. And for me, it happened most probably during the boss fights. It didn't really come into play so much in the main worlds, but it's always nice to pick it up. It lets you know that you can slow down and be more cautious with your jumps. And then also the hearts, which I mentioned already. The extend hearts are just extra lives. Now, if you do die, if you run out of lives, you have to start from the very beginning of the game, back at World 1, unless you hold A and press start. And in that instance, you'll start back at the beginning of the world you most recently died on. So if you made it to World 2, World 3, World 4, the further you made it, you'll be able to start at the beginning. And I don't think I would have been able to make it through this game were it not for that feature. It's not impossible, but it is pretty difficult. It's certainly frustrating enough to make me want to stop without a function like that. So good thing they put it in. Now, the enemies are not really worth mentioning for the most part. They're largely forgettable, aside from the fact that they have some of the best names in any NES game that I've played so far. You've got the menacing meanies, which is the most basic enemy in the game, and they start out kind of not so menacing, but later they'll chase you when you land and they'll come backwards to get you. It's really hard. The white willies, they kind of fly through the air in some instances, and also sometimes you'll find them on the ground. They look kind of like menacing meanies, but they're faster and tougher. The handmen, this is like not really an enemy so much as it is a barrier. You can run into them and they bounce you back. They eat clock, that's why they're bad. And you can't shoot them, but they're usually used to kind of block off certain places and stages where you need to progress a specific way. So that's mostly what they're there for. They're the most annoying enemy in the game for me. The robot heads, I honestly don't even remember seeing. I couldn't tell you what world right now without looking it up that you find them. In fact, a lot of the different enemies in this game, like I said, extremely forgettable, but I'll still go through the rest of them rapid fire just to get them on screen so you can see them. Venus Die Trap, Calamitous Clams, Seashells, Spinners, like fidget spinners are in this game, Vapor Clouds, Dog Face, Diamond Demons, and Mean TVs to cap it off. The enemies are pretty much all just things that you have to avoid. If you touch them, you die instantly. You can blast them, sometimes it's fun, but whatever. The jumpers are not really enemies, but they look kind of like them at first. At least I was scared of them and trying to avoid them at first, but they're required to get through several of the stages. There's the junior jumpers, which are more common, and then there's also super jumpers that burst you really high up into the air and you'll disappear from the screen entirely for a little while before coming back down. Some of the gimmicks and some of the worlds are based off utilizing these jumpers to cross otherwise uncrossable gaps that would be too high for Jumpin' Jack to cross on his own. So the bosses, this is a cool one of the both. It's simultaneously one of the coolest things in this game and the worst thing about this game, because at first it really does seem just like fighting a dragon in Space Harrier. In fact, it's kind of cool to look at. Featured on the box, you've got these big pink dragons, and they're not all pink. They don't really look like this. They look more like, I don't know, a Japanese style dragon. And you have to defeat the head of the serpent. That kills the whole serpent, but you also have the ability to shoot the other pieces of the serpent. These are a little easier to hit because if you're shooting the head and you move out of the way, if any piece of the serpent touches you, you die. So it kind of goes in this way where it goes forward and backwards. And it's hard to judge the depth of them sometimes. Like, it's hard to judge depth in general in this game, and that's one of the bigger flaws of it. The main issue with the bosses, though, is that as you go through the worlds, they increase the difficulty of them in kind of a fake way. They have more health, and you have to defeat them multiple times. So in World 1, you only have to defeat that boss one time. In World 2, it's 2 times. And it goes up and it's 2 for a while, and then it's 3 for a while with more health as well. And then on the final world, you have to beat it 6 times. And what world is that fun? Just doing the same thing over and over again. And the whole time you're just mashing the button. And it's like your hand's tired, your controller's sweaty, you're just pressing it. I'm switching to do double tapping with my fingers. I'm switching back to regular. It's just getting old. I'm just trying to kill it in the time limit. Patently not fun. Probably one of the worst things about this game, despite how cool it looks, because it is very cool. And I feel like this game needs something like that. It needs stuff like that to come out and kind of, act as some of that wow factor that is kind of what this game I feel like is shooting for. But to run through them real quick, the serpent beasts are as follows. It's just kind of a regular serpent in World 1, you have to beat it once. It's more of a robot serpent in World 2, and you have to beat it twice. World 3 has a gimmick to it in that it blends in with the black background, and so you have to beat this one twice, but it's kind of cool because you can't see it at first. This is probably one of my favorite boss serpents that there are. World 4 looks maybe the coolest. It kind of looks like an abominable snowman with little devil horns. You have to beat that one 3 times though. World 5 is a frog, also 3 times you have to beat it. World 6, actually, I take it back. This is probably my favorite. It's like a Cyclops centipede serpent beast, and I really like that one. World 7 has got to be the cutest. You got to beat that 4 times, though. It's the lion-looking serpent beast. And then World 8 is just a menacing meanie in serpent beast form. And that's the one that you have to beat 6 times, and that's the one that I have the most issue with. I had to go back to it, basically. I failed several times, and it was pretty frustrating. Pretty frustrating. So that really is kind of 3D WorldRunner, just surface level. I'm going to get in more to the worlds a little more into what the gimmicks are that you'll see in each world and what I like about that. But I want to take a brief aside to talk about the manual for this game. This game has no business having a manual this good. It's the biggest Famicom manual I've seen so far. It's the prettiest. The art is the best. You go through and it shows you each serpent beast that's in the game. Maximum detail. So many cool action shots of Jumpin' Jack. He's even playing the game. Look, he's playing the game in 3D with the glasses on. It's popping out of the screen at him. It goes over just everything in the most pleasant way possible. The print is so big. It's so large. You see the menacing meanies. You see the white willies. There he is waving. You see the different serpent beasts. It gives you a much better understanding of what they're actually supposed to look like. With thick outlines too. And it also gives you some tips on how to take care and how to not take care of your Famicom Disk System floppy disks. So really impressed with this. I just felt I had to mention it because it's so nice. And even after all these years, the colors have held up beautifully. Back to scheduled programming though. And the scheduled programming is another brief aside about who programmed this game. This is the first Square project that Nasir Gebelli, apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but the famed Iranian-American programmer that worked on Square games and programmed Final Fantasy and Secret of Mana, this was his first Square project, the 3D Battles of WorldRunner. There are a lot of interesting things about this guy, and I know that he liked to program games in assembly, which is kind of wild.
Did you ever use Merlin or anything like that? You were always mini assembler. Wow. No
always
comments.
mini assembler.
No comments or nothing.
It's also kind of necessary for certain older games, but he didn't have to. Anyway, worth looking into him more if you have a spare moment. Now, I'd like to go over my experience playing this game a little bit. The first 4 worlds of 3D WorldRunner are pretty fun. I was having a pretty decent time, I'd say, up until around World 5 is where things kind of changed for me a little bit. But after World 6, the game really kind of hits a wall where it just doesn't feel worth it. The game isn't showing you enough that's new. It's not providing you with an adequate answer as to whether or not it is worth continuing and worth grinding through the more difficult stages just to say you beat it. It doesn't leave you with anything really once you beat it other than access to a hard mode. And now it's really cute how the game presents that option to play hard mode. It takes a really long time, but it's cute. I liked it, but that doesn't feel like an adequate reward. The game's not quite fun enough on its own, if that makes sense. It's not like overcoming a big challenge in, say, Castlevania, where it feels unbelievably good to beat that game. 3D WorldRunner, beating it just feels like, okay, all right, beat 3D WorldRunner today. I might not even put it in my diary. Probably not even that note. No, I'd put it in. If I had a diary, I'd put it in. It's interesting because I feel like this game could have done a few things better, and it's one of those instances where I don't have specific recommendations, but I think it's worth going into the worlds and the gimmicks because that's kind of the most clever and interesting thing going and 3D WorldRunner. World 1 is called Uno. It has 4 stages, and it's mostly about teaching you the basics. It's got these pink sort of wooden looking towers in the background and also a bunch of trees. It's probably the most aesthetically pleasing and color palette aside from the third world, but it's just teaching you about what the power-ups are, to run into the columns if you read the manual, because you could beat it without running into the columns, and just learning how to time your jumps correctly. The second world is called Toro, and it has 3 stages. Asteroid-looking moon or something with a green planet featured in the background and stars. If you're a fan of typical space stuff, you might like it. It was maybe my least favorite though. It has a few stages that introduce you to the Handman's enemies, and it also requires some forced sprinting. That's basically where you can't slow down, you have to keep going. The third world is Caverno, and it's 4 stages. It's basically the fantasy zone though. This is the one with blue and white towers, and it's got these big giant flowers and these white buildings that kind of look like Utopia or something like that. It features the junior jumper gimmick, and it builds upon it too, and it's kind of clever, but it has you crossing these massive canyons, and you can skip them 2 at a time, but I had the most success just going slow because it provided me just enough time to make it going slow, and then just bouncing off of 1 at a time. It looks kind of complicated, but all I'm actually doing is nothing. I'm not controlling anything at all. I'm just bouncing, and occasionally you'll have to move to the left or to the right in order to hit the next one. The fourth world is Quanto, and it's 3 stages, and the main gimmick here is fire columns being used as guideposts. The fire columns are meant to be avoided, but sometimes the game pulls you in and rewards you for going between them. And this is one of the more clever things probably about 3D WorldRunner if I'm having to point something out that I would consider potentially clever. The background has blue bubble structures and giant seaweed looking things. The fifth world is Temero, and it's 3 stages, and it features a sky waterfall watering giant hamburger buns. This is the Handmen world, and it's where they block your path, and they're also put right before jumps. This was one of the more frustrating worlds that still wasn't technically that difficult. It was just really annoying. You'd have to either jump full sprinting before reaching the Handmen right at the end stages, or kind of angle yourself and hold back to slow down and jump to the side, and then jump over big gaps. I died a lot here. Aquo is the 6th world, and it has 4 stages, and it features pink bubble hills and mountain ranges. And this one was the most confusing to me at first because I had to consult the manual once again because it requires very specific timing to jump on columns. If you time your bounce back correctly, hold back and then hold jump, you'll make it on top of a column, and at that point you just bounce on it just like you would a junior jumper. It's kind of cool, but the setup just makes it a more frustrating take on the junior jumper world. Now, the 7th world is Inviso, and it features 3 stages, and the background is a mix of stars and stretched diamonds, screaming geometrically. Forced double speed running is the gimmick to this world. It is possibly the most hectic and chaotic of the worlds, but I found it easier than World 6 and World 8. Fino is the final world, and it has 4 stages, and it takes place in what is essentially Space Seattle. This one is really annoying because it starts off where the gimmick is jumping on the columns, but the columns are the fire columns, which why would I know that I could jump on fire columns? The answer is, well, there was nothing else to do, and it kind of looked like the column jumping stages. And that's exactly what it is. You have to pick up invincibility and time it just right and jump on top of the columns. Not the most fun. And then having to beat the boss 6 times, also not the most fun. So this has been a little all over the place, but circling around, back to final thoughts. Final thoughts on 3D WorldRunner. Whatever. Peace. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what's gotten into me with this one. 3D WorldRunner is a pretty game. The graphics are great. It runs well. It's impressive. What it accomplishes, it's not quite a tech demo. There's a full game there, but I'd love to see an RPG on the NES that utilized this sort of movement over like the world like that. I'm not sure that would be possible to fit two kinds of games on one cartridge or one disc like that. That would have been really sick. I think it would have been really cool if you could move backwards in the stages, kind of like in Mario, if you could actually explore and if the enemies weren't moving too fast. The hard mode, I did try it out, by the way. It's just faster enemies, which that's not what anyone's looking for, I think, to play this game. It's not like, you know what I wish? I wish the really fast moving enemies moved even faster. Because a lot of times it feels like chance. When you're jumping up and down in the later worlds, it feels like chance sometimes when you just land on an enemy. They're moving so fast, you're trying to avoid them, and sometimes it helps you think, maybe if I go at an angle, I don't know. It frustrated me a little bit at the end. It definitely feels on the bottom half of the games I've covered so far, and I had a few conversations about whether or not this might be, it's between Sky Destroyer and Bird Week and 3D WorldRunner. Like, where would I rank those? Aesthetically and conceptually, you gotta give it to Bird Week, even though it's maybe the worst game I've covered so far, because it's just so impossibly difficult. Sky Destroyer is less interesting to look at in 3D, but it's easier to gauge where things are in 3D, except for the bullets. That's probably important, but it's easier to see where you're shooting, I think, a little bit. Well, actually, maybe not. I don't know. Sky Destroyer just felt more big and open, less crowded, less claustrophobic than 3D WorldRunner. But 3D WorldRunner is probably the most fun of those games. Now, and Sky Destroyer being able to blast the B-52 bombers on top, or nailing a submarine on the horizon, which I probably don't even have footage of anymore, and it would probably be too difficult to even recreate that myself, but 3D WorldRunner probably comes out on top. Final thoughts on 3D WorldRunner. It's fine. It's not a hidden gem. It's not bad. It's fine. It's neat. It's nifty, and I think if it were just neat and nifty, it would be elevated a little higher. But the things that it does that are frustrating kind of brings it back down to just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I wish I had more to say, but it is what it is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. I gave it my best shot, okay? I gave it my best shot.